everyone. Biden's visit to the Middle East toward a regional recalibration is the topic of our tonight meeting, a step in our approach to the 8th edition of MED Dialogue, the annual conference ISPI organizes together with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It will be December 1st and 3rd, from 1st to 3rd of December. I'm Ugo Tramballi, Senior Advisor with ISPI, the Italian Institute for International Studies, and columnist with Il Sole 24 Ore, the Italian equivalent of Financial Times. Well, actually, it's hard to sum up the last President Biden's mission in the Middle East. Two countries, one unoccupied entity, a summit with the GCC, a meeting with, if I well remember, 9 leaders of our countries, plus several one-to-one meetings. Oil production and the control of the price of the barrel, containment of China and Russia, Iran's nuclear program, Israel's inclusion in the region, realism and the geopolitics versus human rights, and last but not least, the attempt to define a renewed form of U.S. standing in the region. Possibly in the longer term, the making of a system of collective regional security after more than 20 years of conflict, civil wars, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. And for sure, I'm missing something. We'll try to figure out the meaning of and the results of the Joe Biden's visit with our guest. Christian Smith Diwan, a senior resident of the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, D.C., Nimrod Goren, president of the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies in Tel Aviv, and William Wexler, director of the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East and the Atlantic Council, again in D.C. Thank you to be with us. So watching the press conference of Prince Faisal bin Farhan, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the interviews with the State Minister Abdel Al-Jubeir, and reading the Arab press, actually I wouldn't say it has been a successful visit. I don't know, but so I want to, before our real dialogue, I want to ask you shortly, in a sentence, your opinion: positive, negative, just useful or pointless. Then, of course, during our conversation, you will better elaborate your opinions. Christine.
Well, I'll say it's positive, but it's like a first step. And before going into too much depth, but there's a lot of change priorities with the global situation, with the regionalization that's going on, and just having the U.S. step back in a more direct way is really critical. Of course, the kind of headline is going to be the negative, especially with the Saudi visit, because of the obvious tension with what the Biden administration had put forward about their democracy agenda and their need to set a different tone with Saudi Arabia. So the meeting with MBS, of course, set sort of a sour note for a lot of people and politically in the United States. But overall, I think it's probably a necessary corrective, and we'll get into more details, I'm sure.
Nimrod.
Thank you. I think it was positive in regards to Israeli politics, as Israel has 2 elections in November 1st, being the first such visit with Yair Lapid as Prime Minister, giving back wind to liberal Democrats in Israel. It was positive in regard of Israel's integration into the Middle East and deepening some of the normalization ties and some opening with the Saudis. It didn't matter a lot on the Palestinian issue, which is a negative issue on its own. The lack of real American involvement on efforts to advance a 2-state solution beyond some specific steps that have been taken.
Thank you. William?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly positive. There is, and more to the point, it was actually politically courageous. This is an example of a president of the United States doing his job, and doing his job in ways that there's not a lot of upside for him domestically, but he was able to advance U.S. interests, at least start the process of doing so. And happy to talk about this more as we continue the discussion.
Thank you very much. So thank you all. So let me follow the steps and the timetable of Joe Biden's visit in the region. I start with Nimrod. The visit in Israel did improve somehow the bilateral relations. for many extent, Israel in U.S. is a domestic, not less than an international issue, more or less like Cuba. So did you see a real change, something new on these relations?
First, a presidential visit to Israel is always a thing of festivity in Israel. Last time it happened was 5 years ago or so. The strong alliance, the strong bond between the countries makes such a visit something that Israelis care about quite a lot. And the prime minister that hosts the American president in Jerusalem is usually getting political capital out of it. And the specific timing in which this visit was held, just after Lapid is assuming the role of interim prime minister, and as he embarks on his political campaign towards the elections, positioning himself as a leader that can deliver on Israel's interests in the international arena and have good cordial relations with an American president, that by itself was a success for him and for his campaign. This visit, much like the visit that Lapid did to Paris a week before, were actually planned to have Bennett as prime minister, but political change in Israel kind of shifted the cards. In terms of the content, there was no real news on the bilateral level. The two sides did sign the Jerusalem declarations, reaffirming a strategic partnership between the states, which is an important term to use in Israeli-American relationship. But the content was basically summarizing all the achievements of these relations till today, reaffirming them, emphasizing the values, the bonds, putting an horizon on a visa waiver program that Israelis care about, and doing some steps regarding the Saudis, which for Lapid, for the Israelis, were the big prize of this visit, having another Arab country moving, even if very slowly, towards some better relations or more open relations with Israel.
So I stay on this somehow on this issue. Christine, on your opinion, how far is the announcement of formal diplomatic ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia? I mean, maybe before the visit, both Israel and the United States were too much optimistic.
Well, I mean, I think there's a tension there, right, for the Saudis, at least speaking from the Saudi perspective, because they have previously and kind of held themselves to the Arab Initiative, which says, quite frankly, that they're willing to take steps in all of the Arab states towards better ties with Israel, but that the Palestinian situation should be addressed first. So it's a matter of kind of sequencing. And of course, the Abraham Accords, that were made with some of the other states, UAE and Bahrain, reversed that, right? And said that we're willing to increase our ties with Israel, and then maybe something positive will come for the Palestinians. But anyway, we're not going to let that be a barrier to our increased ties and interests. So I think if you look at the announcements, there's some, you're right to see that there's some contradictions or inconsistencies in how the US and Israel were trying to more positively present that the steps that were taken, such as the Saudis allowing now the air flights, the measures that seem to be negotiated about the Saudis also allowing for direct flights for pilgrims coming from Israel to Saudi Arabia. Maybe that's not quite finished yet, but sort of announcements about that. They wanted to definitely present in terms of the Saudis taking these steps towards greater normalization, where the Saudis want to try to hold still a little bit to the Arab Initiative and say that we need this other progress on the Palestinians first. So they wanted to place those as these were just general steps that we were taking towards international connectivity. It's not linked directly to Israel. So I think that shows just the contradiction and or the difficulties in where the Saudis stand. But I think if you look overall of the direction of the ties and some of the other steps that were taken, especially towards the islands too, which I think is the more fascinating thing, the Saudis have been very anxious to get back these two islands from Egypt. And now the cooperation has been done so that they can actually take more possession and do things with them. And I think that speaks to this overall development that the Saudis are doing along the Red Sea coast, and especially that area where they want to build Neom. And I think that's just a statement of sort of intent of that they're putting a lot more in their diversified economy towards that area. And that kind of naturally draws them in towards kind of linking into Egypt and Jordan and Israel along kind of that Red Sea coastline. And so I think that, along with the security things, which we can talk about, obviously, mean that the intent of Saudi Arabia is to be opening more in that direction.
Thank you. Now we will come back to this issue later with Nimrod, but now I want to ask to William how this trip, from the American perspective, how this trip will recalibrate the U.S. Middle East policy. I mean, I quote, "We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran," as Biden said. And seems to me that the main rationale, the main synthesis of his visit. Am I correct, William?
You are correct, and it's these interests that we have that have been driving U.S. policy in the Middle East for many decades now. I mean, in reality, since President Franklin Roosevelt met with Abdulaziz way back in the 1940s. So there is, you mentioned previously a domestic political component to this. There is a domestic political component, as there is for many issues, but it's vastly overstated. It's these interests that are driving actions. And again, from a domestic political point of view, this was a challenge for the administration. They had to overcome that challenge in order to take this trip. So what are those interests? Those interests are fundamentally the price of oil. Saudi is the swing producer. Saudi and the UAE are the only countries with spare production, which is critically important in the context of a war that Russia started and the resulting sanctions, which takes a lot of their oil off the markets. This region is critically important for security. Saudi Arabia, Israel help project U.S. power, are important intelligence partners for us, with the threat from Iran increasing. It's important for regional geopolitics. We already heard a little bit about the Abraham Accords, and Saudi is critical to what has already happened for the Abraham Accords and Israel's normalization, and it will be important for the future of the normalization and the resulting implications there. This trip was important for global geopolitics, with Russia and China moving in, as the quote that you just said. This part of the world has always been a critical player. Of course, when President Carter created the Carter Doctrine that codified, the U.S. commitment to the region, it was immediately after Russia invaded Afghanistan. That's the connections are quite clear. Important for terrorism. These parts of this world are a critical partner for our counterterrorism world, and the threats still very much exist. As you saw, there was just a strike that was taken just a couple of weeks ago by the United States against an Islamic State leader. This is ongoing. This is a real issue. And then you get to very specific problems about Saudi Arabia, about the future of Islam. Saudi is the custodian of the two holy mosques. It matters. This is not just in Saudi, but around the world. The internal stability of Saudi Arabia matters with Vision 2030, and human rights matter. They do matter. This is not a let's ignore human rights, but this is a question of, in the context of the countries that we're talking about, how does the United States do the best job at advancing human rights? And we found over the years that it's much better to have those conversations with a degree of trust amongst friends than it is just from the outside. And all of these were undermined by the widespread perception of American withdrawal, which has been building basically for the last 20 years since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a disaster. That won't be reversed overnight, but we've had the first president in that period of time that has made a very explicit argument to start that reversal. And so I was very happy to see that.
Sure. Thank you. Christine, I come back to you. Again, I stress again the same quotation, the Joe Biden quotation I made before with with William. We will not walk away. It seems to be the anthem of Liverpool Football Club for some extent. But anyway,
walk alone.
yeah. But it's fine. But what are the kingdom's key strategic priorities emerging from the talks, and how do they match with the American interest that, for instance, William just mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think he was pretty comprehensive in mapping out all of the different American interests. I think I'll just sort of underline how much, what's coming before this visit is the change, the global change that's happened. That's really, and somehow forcing and making this much more important. And that is really the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I think that's completely reoriented American priorities, European priorities, and their two priorities together now, and supporting this transatlantic alliance. And a key element of that, of course, is energy security. And I'll repeat that, anytime we're talking about energy security, of course, we are talking about Saudi Arabia. And I just want to underline that that's a market issue, but it's also a political issue, given that Saudi Arabia has built its strategic alliance or its relationship with Russia very much through the energy markets. So as the U.S. is really seeking to both, make sure that the Saudis have a more positive position towards increasing, and also effectively asking them on some level to step away from this agreement with Russia. And that has geopolitical implications as well, to helping to replace or be more positive in replacing, as Europe is starting to sanction Russia. I think that was very hard to do when there were such sort of conflictual ties between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. So this is such a high priority right now. I think that oil thing is so central to what is going on right now, but it's more than oil, right? It's about the geostrategic picture and those relations. And I know when we come out of these talks, oil didn't take the headline, and I think neither of the states really wanted it to take the headline, because Biden couldn't expect that there would be, a change immediately. And of course, the Saudis are looking for much more beyond just oil, and they don't want it to be just about oil and security or to highlight that. But I think we'll only see how much that improves, as we go into August, when the OPEC plus agreement was winding down. And then as the European sanctions start to take place in the fall, then we'll start to see if that payoff is there. So I do think that is a key thing. The other, of course, being Iran, the change with the Iran negotiations, the JCPOA agreement more and more looks like it's not going to be going through. And, we know that the regional states have already taken steps to meet their own security in case that happens, or even in the face of it happening, right? And the U.S. has not really been as much in there with them in this now sort of changed reality. So obviously there were needed to be steps to increase that coordination, to have the U.S. step in and be more of a leadership role instead of kind of being behind, if there are going to have to be a new arrangement where the U.S. is not going to have that agreement. So I'd say those were the two key geopolitical shifts that were driving things, and the two key things that the U.S. needed to approach in these broader talks.
Thank you. I forgot before. I want just to remind to our public that you can send your questions if you want on our chat. Let's come back to the Israeli-Palestinian framework. In Bethlehem, Joe Biden, Nimrod. In Bethlehem, Joe Biden reiterated a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, but lots of fine words, but at the end, anything concrete. It's because of the new elections, again, one more time in Israel, so you cannot have, you don't have any horizons of the chance to reopen a sort of diplomatic dialogue, or is because the American administration is not willing to be involved again on the Palestinian track, on the Palestinian file?
The Israeli-Palestinian peace process is very important for Israel, from my point of view. And it's something that both Israeli political parties need to engage on and emphasize, but both our international partners should show how important and relevant it is. So as a pro-peace Israeli, to have an American president proactively advocate for a two-state solution is important. This advocacy was not done strong enough, let's say, in the op-ed that Biden authored before he came to visit. Yes, it was voiced in Bethlehem and in the conversation with the Palestinian leadership, but it was not coupled by a political move. So we saw a continuation of the process, an important process that this administration is doing, in which it is rebuilding the ties with the Palestinians that were cut off during the troublesome years of Trump in office. Those years, there were no engagement between the Palestinian and the American leadership after the first meetings took place. There was no American support in the two-state solution. There was a signal that the Jerusalem issue is off the table. Funding was cut off to Palestinian entities and to people-to-people activities. So all of this is changing during the Biden presidency. So what we saw during the visit was a continuation of these things. It was, again, the engagement with the leadership, the resumed funding, including for UNRWA, the grants that were announced to two NGOs, the Paris Center and Appleseed, for people-to-people engagement, the signal that the U.S. may be changing some policy in Jerusalem by the visit to the hospital without an Israeli escort, as is usually done in such cases. But that's not a political horizon. That's not tackling the issue of the two-state solution and pushing on the Israeli government, notwithstanding any political conditions in Israel to try and advance this from happening. Yes, we did see some small signs, encouraging ones, on linking normalization states to the Palestinian issue. That's something that the Americans could have pushed harder for, to link the Israeli-Arab normalization to progress in the peace process. We saw something with Morocco, which was helpful in mediating the agreement over the Allenby crossing, enabling Palestinians to move more easily to Jordan. Morocco played a role there. We saw the UAE and Gulf state perhaps pitching in terms of the financial aid to Palestinian hospitals. And we saw this summit, this unilateral summit with the Americans, India, the UAE, and Israel, somehow linking all of that. So there are some signs that the Palestinian issue is relevant to Israel-Arab normalization. Very low-key, not active American involvement towards diplomatic solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And again, as was mentioned before, the Saudi commitment to the two-state solution, to the Arab Peace Initiative, as a prerequisite for actual normalization, notwithstanding the steps that are being taken even before that.
Well, Nimrod, I can say I totally agree with what you said right now. I can buy every word, but this is only the point of view of one part of Israel, of the Israelis. Maybe the Israelis I like, but I don't believe. I'm afraid that to solve the Palestinian problem is not very important also for Bibi Netanyahu and for the front of the new rights. I mean, I live in Jerusalem, so I'm watching day by day how is increasing the continuously the moving to the right side of the country. I'm afraid that your position is not. It doesn't represent the point of view of the majority of Israel today. Am I wrong? Regarding the Palestinian.
There is a difference between political positions on how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which I think the Israeli public still there is a majority supporting the two-state solution, whatever it means, because different people have different variations of that, but this is still the preferred solution among the Israeli public, and electoral tendencies in which the Israeli public is very clearly shifting rightwards to parties that do not support that. Okay, but currently we have a prime minister that is on record and said it also during the Biden visit, that he supports a two-state solution. He doesn't see it as a feasible option at the current time, but his political, ideological position is one that is supportive of that solution. So whether that will move the peace process forward, I'm skeptical. But having someone like that as prime minister is not something we had for the last decade or so in Israeli politics.
Sure, thank you. William, with the absolute power and with the Putinian power, I have been the moderator of this meeting. I'll tell you what I think about the visit from the American point perspective, the American visit, the Biden visit in the Middle East. So the US wants to keep the strong presence in the region, but they wants to make up a framework, a system of economic and security cooperation among regional actors that are as large as possible, strong enough to deal with crises and potential conflicts, not to be involved again with a direct, for instance, military involvement, etc. Because the issue of today is not to, yes, of course, not to open to open room for Chinese and Russians, but basically because the issue for today and tomorrow in Washington is China, much more than Middle East. Sounds good. Is it achievable?
Yes, you're right. I mean, quite frankly, I'd go even one step further. The most important issue for America today is domestics. It's a whole series of domestic issues. But when you get to foreign policy, the administration has been quite clear from the beginning that great power competition, particularly the strategic threat from China, and now the most immediate threat from Russia, are the highest of the priorities. But you don't do great power competition with Russia only in Eastern Europe, and you don't do great power competition with China only in the South China Sea. By definition, these are global issues, and by definition, because of all the interests that I went through before, the Middle East part of the world plays a disproportionately important role when you talk about global issues, and has for a long period of time. The big difference here is that for about 50 years, from 1953 to 2003, the United States across multiple administrations had a basically successful approach to the Middle East at a strategic level, and that was we were a classic status quo power. If you looked at what we were trying to accomplish, it was trying to support the status quo, trying to return to the status quo when it was overturned, trying to prevent threats to the status quo when they emerged. Starting in 2003, consecutive presidents reversed that and became threats to the status quo in different ways, but they all did that. I think what we're seeing now, I hope what we're seeing now is a return to that original strategy. And what that means in today's context is exactly what you said, which is the United States needs to take advantage of the chessboard being rearranged, and a number of countries that historically didn't play significant roles in regional securities, only content to their own security, are now with the potential to play a significant role in regional security. So you're talking about the Gulf, you're talking about Israel, and they're coming together. That's the geopolitical impact of the Abraham Accords. And so the question in front of us now is, do they do that in the absence of the United States? Or do they do that with the deep cooperation of the United States? I think that the latter is a much higher likelihood of securing U.S. interests than the former.
Thank you. Yeah, sure, very good. Christine, what Biden will achieve? I mean, I believe that it takes time to understand exactly the achievement, especially with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. It takes time to see what are they doing regarding for instance, the increasing of oil productions and so on. But on your opinion, what Biden will achieve after his meeting with GCC +3? By the way, we don't have to forget Jordan, more important, Egypt and Iraq.
Well, just to build a bit off what William just said, I think when we look at the region, we see that this regionalization process has been going on apace, sort of without the U.S., in the context, I guess, of an assumption that there's sort of less going to be less U.S. Leadership or involvement in the region, or at least maybe inconsistent policies from the U.S. And in that context, we've seen the Abraham Accords, and we've seen a number of other initiatives too. And it's worth underlining that all these different initiatives that the regional powers are taking haven't always been consistent, and sometimes they've even been competitive. So, of course, we saw the previous quartet of countries that then took a boycott against Qatar. We had the Qatar-Turkey kind of then axis that was establishing itself. And it's worth noting that this Egypt Jordan, Iraq kind of grouping too also initially came about in reaction to some of the actions that the Gulf states were taking that they were a bit anxious about, or some of their interests that they didn't see being taken. So what I'm saying is that there's been, different kinds of regional reactions, disjointed regional reactions, trying to address the different security challenges, whether coming from Syria, economic, coming from Iran, and that the U.S. hasn't always been a central peg of that. So I think, Biden said it directly. Two key things were really important here. One, saying that the U.S. is sort of back. Let me state clearly, he said there's a quote, that the United States is going to remain active, engaged partner in the Middle East. And then second, saying that we will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. And, that American leadership is going to play a role here. And then another element of it is this idea of integration and interconnection. So to try to play a role to kind of bridge, and we've already seen this against the regional states have already, to some extent, post-COVID, and then the challenge of facing Iran, have started to sort of mend fences. We know that the Qatar standoff with the Quartet countries and with Turkey is not as forceful as it was before. But I think the U.S. is trying to play a deeper role than in this integration and interconnection between all of these different states. We can see that with maybe now trying to play a more active role in the Abraham Accords. And I think Israel was very active, keen to see the U.S. and the Biden administration specifically step into that, because I think the United States or the Biden administration post-Trump wasn't being so eager. And also as well, we can talk about integration in terms of, there was the announcement about trying to finally make some progress on this energy cooperation towards Iraq. So to try to weave in some of these other states too. So the role that American leadership can play in sort of easing some of the roughness between these different alliances, and to have a broader coalition than that the U.S. is, again, leading.
Sure. Christy, you remind me that you oblige me to come back with William to the American political landscape. I wonder if is the American public opinion still interested in the Middle East? In other words, in a few months we will have the midterms elections, and so what will happen? How can this visit could contribute to improve the hope of Joe Biden, of the Democrats, and at the end. How credible is the United States today? Watching the last visit, because I believe anyone, not only we European, but I'm Italian. I wouldn't with our political landscape. It's I know. I shouldn't ask you this, but I'm an observer as a moderator and journalist, etc. How could the United States be credible, considering that it's not that difficult that in 2 years another MAGA president, I wouldn't say the former president, but another more professional Trump could become president of the United States?
No, it's a huge problem for American credibility, because our domestic divisions and the extremes to which our domestic debate is been moving doesn't just affect us here at home. It affects the credibility of the president abroad. And when you compare the 50 years that I talked about before, where we went from 1953 to 2003, where Democrats and Republicans definitely shared their times in power, but there was overall a relatively consistent policy. What we see more recently is great swings in approaches from American presidencies. And that's, of course, a product of the underlying divisions within the United States. Now, it's important also to note that and this is potentially good news, is that as compared to many other countries, foreign policy is not an important issue in the American domestic politics. Given the importance of the United States in many issues around the world, I often find that people outside of the United States are very surprised by this reality. But the majority of Americans don't own a passport. It is not something that is particularly important when they make their decisions about election. It's certainly not important when it's a midterm election only about the Congress. But what that does allow is a president to have a much greater degree of autonomy around his foreign policy decisions, much more so than domestic policy positions. So there's no reason why we can't move back to a more consistent bipartisan approach to foreign policy, notwithstanding the political divisions within our country. But I would say is in that, the only other thing that I'd add is in that context, the most important political challenge that President Biden faced with this recent trip was not from the opposition, from the Republicans, from the MAGA side, but was from within the Democratic Party and from the left that doesn't like Saudi Arabia, doesn't like MBS, remembers, of course, the murder of Khashoggi as they should, but also doesn't like Israel, doesn't like generally the United States being involved in foreign policy. The isolationist extreme wings of both parties have become stronger in the last 20 years.
So if I well understand, if I well remember, it was Carnegie who made the program of a foreign policy for the middle class that didn't, fail basically. It didn't change the attitude of the American public opinion. Thank you, William. Nimrod, since now that the skies are open between the Gulf and the peninsula and Israel, I come back to you. In a few days ago, in a column on the New York Times, Tom Friedman said that Saudi Arabia is, translating, that Saudi Arabia is the last hope for a Palestinian state, because Israel needs the Saudi recognition, and the Saudi wants to see a state for the Palestinian to grant this recognition. This is the framework. Is this the framework?
But there's a limit to how much the Saudis can press Israelis to change their policies on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We saw it with the Arab Peace Initiative, which is originated by the Saudis 20 years ago, offering Israel normalization, security, conflict resolution with all the Arab world, later on ratified by the entire Islamic world, and it didn't change at all the Israeli position. Israel hasn't even replied officially to the Arab Peace Initiative in 20 years. So when the incentive was very strong, Israel was offered something it aspired for since its establishment, and it didn't have it until a couple of years ago with many countries in the region. Still, it wasn't strong enough. So definitely there is a need to link the normalization with the Saudi with progress towards the peace process. This is the Saudi leadership is reiterating that. We'll need to see whether this position continues if and when MBS takes full control of the country. He has a different position than the king as is being seen. But definitely the linkage is important. The linkage could be evident in different settings as well. For example, during the Biden visit, there was a lot of references to the Negev summit, in which Israel, the countries of normalization, together with Egypt, convened, later on developed all kinds of working groups on civilian security affairs. Jordan was not there, the Palestinians were not there. Part of the linkage is for the Americans to make sure that the next time this summit of forum convenes, it deals with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and they make an effort to also bring on board those who weren't there. So Saudi Arabia is an important component. It cannot do it on its own. Definitely interesting to see the role, you mentioned the open skies, that civic aviation is playing in Israel's regional relationship. We see it all over the place. When relations were resumed with Morocco, Israelis were told they could now fly to Brazil in a shorter period of time. With the EOE, it was the same. Now with the Saudis, it was the same. With Egypt, there were flights resuming to Sharm el-Sheikh recently. With Turkey, civic aviation is an important part of Israel's normalization process. So this is something that being perceived as a point that Israelis care about. Can that be linked somehow to the Palestinian issue? We'll see. But definitely, I think all these new connectivity, and Christine mentioned the ability to connect different regions, we see it happening. We see these minilateral settings with American involvement, with Israel, with regional countries, with Arab countries, all of a sudden take shape and open up new horizons for Israeli diplomacy. The Palestinians should be on board, much like is happening, for example, in the East Mediterranean Gas Forum. Israel and Palestine on a state level, is there together with European and Arab countries, with US involvement. This could happen in other regional settings as well, and the Americans have a role in making that happen.
I hope to see it on my lifetime. I'm not sure we'll be able to see it on my lifetime, but my children, for sure, they will see that. Nimo, so I stay with you again because regarding the Israel inclusion into the region, could you better explain to our public the meaning of I2U2? This as a acronym is, you need a lot of fantasy to use it. But anyway, Israel together with India and the Emirates, it's a sort of quad for the western part of Asia.
Relates to a new phenomenon in Israeli diplomacy. Israel was mostly doing bilateral relations traditionally, usually of zero-sum nature, coming together with a country against an enemy. So in recent years, this has changed. Israel managed to play win-win relationship in the region, for example, having an alliance with Cyprus and Greece while reconciling with Turkey in 2016, having a good relations with Qatar regarding Gaza while developing ties with the UAE in Egypt. So that was a new component. Then the next step was about all kind of groupings that bring together different countries together, not bilaterally. We saw it with the triangular relationship between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, to which the Americans joined, by the way, and played a role. We saw it in the East Med Gas Forum that I mentioned before. The Abraham Accords enabled more groupings like that. So we saw in Cyprus, for example, a meeting between the foreign ministers of Israel, UAE, Cyprus, and Greece, just after the UAE were vetoed by the Palestinians for membership as observers in the Gas Forum. And now we see this I2U2, Israel, India, US, UAE, convening, by the way, for the first time, not during the Biden visit, but already in late 2021, as some kind of this new mechanism that is increasing trade, that promotes economic cooperation, that maybe serves our American interests in India, positioning it vis-a-vis China, leading to projects on food security, on renewable energies, also under the label of enabling Israeli integration by bringing Israel into the region from the back door, perhaps, for India. So taking this Abraham Accord, taking normalization, trying to look how this can impact for the better on other regional settings, and looking for inter-regional connectivity. Bring West Asia, bring Gulf, maybe Red Sea, maybe East Med, maybe also West Med with Morocco, connecting that to the EU. All of a sudden, the entire region is opening up, and all these new configurations could eventually be linked up and create basically total new reality for Israel's foreign policy. This is so different than what we used to be, perceiving the region as hostile, perceiving Israel as isolated. This is a new era of connectivity.
Sure, thank you.
Just mention, Yuko,
please,
just say,
sure, yes.
It's worth underlining, I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, that the I2U2 was an Emirati initiative. So I think that's important to keep in mind too, because this is very much in with the Emirati interests. And it's important to bring them on board sort of as important players, obviously, in all of this. We're talking a lot about Saudi Arabia, their relations with India, their relations with Israel, and their interests in these broader ties and having themselves be central to it. And I think also that this took place before the Biden administration had stepped in to be completely and as supportive as they seem to be now into the Abraham Accords. This was also a way to kind of bring the U.S. back at the Biden administration specifically to be more active and engaged in that front.
Sure, thank you. William, I don't understand still if after the visit or the Biden visit, the JCPOA negotiation with Iran will have a chance to reach an important point, or it's forever now after the visit, it's a mission impossible and we have to, more than ever, we have to forget any possible compromise.
Well, I don't think you can ever say never, but even before this administration began, I gave much, much lower probabilities of success than most people did because of my assessment of where Iran was at this point in time. And Iran does not seem as strategically interested in such an accord. There's an awful lot of jockeying going on inside Iran for what's going to happen after the supreme leader departs our world, and everything has to be seen through that context. So while it's possible, I don't see it likely. The issue that it's being held up on right now is a great irony, because it's Iran insisting that the United States remove its designation of the IRGC as a terrorist group, when in the original negotiations, the United States wanted to include wider issues than the nuclear subject, and Iran absolutely refused to have any such issues brought to the table. And now they're putting an issue that is not about the nuclear challenges on the table. That to me reads as somebody, as an entity that actually doesn't want this to occur. And of course, even through the entire Biden administration, there have never been direct negotiations, not because of the desires of the United States, but because Iran hasn't allowed for direct negotiations. So it's not a positive environment, I wouldn't think, but you never know what could happen.
Sure. Christine, last question. Can we define the Jeddah summit as a sort of foundation for a new crisis management, a sort of a first step toward what I said before, a system of regional security? Too much, perhaps.
I think it's a bit too much. That's taking on too much. I think, as I mentioned several times, I think what we've seen is a relative lack of American leadership in all of these areas, and a lot of regional, players kind of stepping up in the absence of that, or in the absence of what they see the U.S. doing what they want to see done. So there's a lot of things to negotiate. And as you see, this was a series of meetings, and then bilateral meetings too, that the Biden administration was taken. There's no question it is a big statement of intent. I think I agree with William too, that the regional players too are going to be a bit skeptical about whether the U.S. is kind of back permanently in this leadership role, but it definitely was a strong move in that direction. So yeah, I think I kind of leave it as we'll have to see on that front.
Thank you. So now we have, because of you are very focused and business-like, we have some time for the questions of our public that we received on our chat. The first question: what are outcomes to the panelists foresee? Sorry, I can't read very well. When it comes to the trilateral meeting in Tehran between Putin, Raisi, and Erdogan, I had another question. Was China the elephant in the room of Biden's trip in the region? How has this series of visits to the Middle East influences Beijing interest in the Middle East? I start with Nimrod, because Israel is part of the region.
So in terms of China, I think the rules of the game have been set between Israel and the US also already in advance. So perhaps the relation with India relates to China. But other than that, the bilateral topics that were raised between Israel and the US, I don't see them as very closely China related. On the summit that you mentioned, I think it's important to know the Turkish component of that summit, because we are currently in the midst of a process in which Israel and Turkey are getting closer together, are moving towards a new chapter in the relationship, are moving towards repositioning ambassadors in both states after 4 years in which there was no ambassadors. So the previous perception in Israel among some circles of Turkey as an ally of Iran may be reignited by such a summit, but I think over the last year or so, with the trust being rebuilt and with a better understanding of Turkish interests and positioning in the region after a high-level dialogue was resumed, I think Israel will view this summit in a different light, and it will not create any damage to efforts to reconcile between Israel and Turkey.
Sure. And I had another question, which is part of the two questions I made before. Does the GCC plus 3 summit in Jeddah and I2U2 constitute the nucleus of a US-led coalition that could potentially dampen Iran's ambitions and Chinese and Russian influence in the region? Is this reality a feasible one? Has Biden's visit contributed to this formation? Just please.
I'll pick up one element of that, the China element, and use it to introduce a second thing that hasn't been discussed more. If you saw kind of what the Saudi messaging was in advance of the meeting, and the op-ed that Princess Bandar was, Rima bin Bandar gave in the United States, it's interesting that they were talking about issues that weren't about oil and weren't about security. They were very much to do with the Saudi Vision 2030 program. And I think it's important to keep in mind that economic transition and cultural and social transition is huge for Saudi Arabia. It's probably beside maybe Iran's security and that kind of, main security is the key thing that they're really focused on their domestic transition too. And their ties internationally and globally are really key to that. I mean, the ability for them to have these relations with US companies, to bring in international visitors, to bring in international investments. And they really want the US as a partner in that. So I think to some degree, some of the announcements that were made gave some intent that the US is willing to play, or the US government is willing to play a bigger step in that. There were agreements about space exploration, other elements of technology, also a welcoming and the G+3 agreement, welcoming all of these agreements on international agreements, on food security, health initiatives. This is another more intentional step of the U.S. Away from the sort of isolation that's happened because of the bad relations with MBS and a lot of skepticism and anxiety about where Saudi Arabia was going. And some of these things linking the U.S. or being more welcoming in that way will have an effect on the Saudis specifically in their desire to move towards China and Russia and others in the absence of feeling that door closed with the Americans. And I think the key one that really stepped up here was the agreement on 5G and developing 5G. This is a huge issue for the Americans. This is an area where China has already had the advance, and a number of Gulf countries are already. The U.S. is very concerned about that, and that information technology works its way also into security issues as well. And so the fact that the U.S. is going to be working with the Saudis to develop that shows a very concrete way where that greater integration and economic cooperation can, in a way, extend American influence and to the deficit, I guess, of China to some degree in these key areas of integration and cooperation.
William?
Let's just take each one of the three challenges in turn. On the Iranian one, there is a lot of opportunity, not for the full-on alliance that you're talking about, but for incremental improvement, including on an institutional basis. And so there's been a lot of discussion of the Middle East Air Defense Alliance that will take advantage of Israel now being able to be an open part of the security architecture for mutually beneficial reasons, and given the developments in terms of precision weaponry that we've seen from Iran, a greater recognition from some of the Gulf countries about a need to cooperate given the inherent geography of the region. So I think there's potential there. On Russia, Russia's interests in the region are almost entirely inimical to U.S. interests in the region, and have been for a long period of time. And I would argue one of the greatest accomplishments of U.S. policy towards the region in my lifetime was the slow moving of Russia out of the region that started in the 70s and went through the 90s. And unfortunately, in the last decade plus, we have let Russia back into the region. And so we're seeing, and not just from a military point of view, both directly and through proxies, but from a diplomatic point of view as well. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to be dealing with for a long time to come. And we're seeing that in the summit that Putin is having with Iran and with Turkey, which not coincidentally is happening right after the American president's visit. China is a different animal, because on the face of it, there are lots of places where U.S. and Chinese interests align in a way that U.S. and Russia interests do not align. In terms of China is basically interested in the free flow of oil and the price of energy being stable. China's basically interested in regional stability and regional security. But the problem is that there's limits to that level of overlap in interests, and there are challenges once you go beyond those things, of which Kristen has just talked about, 5G and a number of others. And in the absence in the perception of the absence of American power, in the perception of the coming withdrawal of American power, every country, every actor in the region has been hedging, and they have to hedge with Russia. They have to hedge with China. There are huge economic opportunities with China, and this has caused greater threats to the long-term stability and security of the region. And so that's why it's a very good thing, once again, that the United States with this trip has stated that we're at the beginning of the process of going back into the region, of reversing the perception of us leaving the region, because we need to be able to have these conversations about China in a professional, a non-hyperbolic but quite serious way, and having these kind of strong relationships at the top are absolutely necessary in order to have those conversations throughout the bilateral relationships.
Thank you. The two very last questions from the public. Rather than intervening militarily, is the Biden administration employing an offshore balancing strategy to give more responsibility to regional allies and contain Iran? The other question, despite the general commitment of the participants in the Jeddah summit to a truce and a national dialogue in Yemen, the Ansar Allah movement recently announced its intention not to renew the 2-month truce in the light of the result of the meeting. What is the impact of those events in the Yemeni peace process? I'll start with Nimrod.
I will relate to the Iran issue, and I would say, of course, that while there are differences in the opinions between Israel and the US and Iran, I think this time the gap seemed a bit smaller than before, the Israeli willingness to engage. Also, the hope in the past that Gulf countries will be brought on board by the Americans. I think perhaps it's seen a bit more realistically now. The discourse about the Abraham Accords, when they were signed in Israel, some referred to the Iranian issue as the glue that binds Israel and the Gulf states together. A couple of years later, we know this is not the case. Coordination on the Iranian issue is happening behind the scenes before, is continuing, has been stepped up, is important, but Israel and some of the Gulf states have different approaches on how to engage Iran. We saw it recently with some statements coming from the UAE and others. So while there is a consolidation of some of this alliance, and Israel is in the background but is involved, I think it is too much to estimate that we are going at a full-out American-backed coalition geared against Iran.
Thank you. William?
The advantage of being fully engaged diplomatically is it becomes clear to others where the heart of the challenge lies. So when you're engaged diplomatically with Iran, it becomes clear that it's actually Iran that is the biggest challenge to an agreement on the nuclear file. When you're engaged in Yemen, it becomes clear that the Houthis are the one that are the largest impediment to a solution there. You only get to understand those those realities by being engaged. And so I'm very happy that this administration started off with the diplomatic approaches on both of those portfolios.
Thank you. Christine?
I'll just step tentatively into the Yemen issue. It's worth underlining that the Biden administration came in with a very different approach, I would say, to Yemen. I think the Trump administration saw Yemen as sort of derivative of their maximum pressure campaign against Iran. The Biden administration came in, I'd say, with Yemen as one of their top priorities in the Middle East region, appointing a new envoy and pressing really hard to try to, in that war, specifically within these series of meetings, I think they were really underlining their success at achieving that truce and hoping to extend that truce. I'm actually just hearing this for the first time, so I'm going to have to see the information about it. There's a lot of things coming out of that. But I would say to the degree that, is, I think they're going to want to look at that and definitely deal with that. But to the degree, that doesn't get achieved, that would be sort of a blow to the overall objectives there.
Well, thank you, PT. We reached the end of our interesting, at least from my point of view, very interesting discussion. Christine Smith-Diwan, the Arab Gulf State Institute, Nimrod Goren, Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, William Wexler, director of Rafik Hariri. I remember President Hariri was a decent person. Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East and the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much indeed. It has been a very interesting discussion. I hope to see you soon, possibly in Washington, D.C. and in Jerusalem. It will be easier for me to come back home. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Thank you.